For the Slightest Philosophy by Quee. This is not too thick of a book. It's self-published. Let me read you the cover. It says, "Get a naive peek at a Ding an sich by doubting what philosophers say no man who reflects has ever doubted." This is a book about, it starts out saying it's about postmodernism, and essentially it attacks postmodernism by going after skepticism. And I'm also writing a book debunking postmodernism, and I agree with her entirely. We have both independently come to the conclusion that postmodernism can trace itself back to the idea that we can't know anything. As far as I'm concerned, all of the nonsense in philosophy can be traced back to the idea that we can't know anything, especially the idea that we can't trust our senses, because everything is founded on our senses. And most of this book, probably starting from about page 40 or so, is in the form of a dialogue between a student and a professor. And the student doesn't know much about philosophy. He adheres to what is called naive realism, which is simply the idea that what you see is what you get. If you feel it, it's there. The professor, of course, is steeped in all of the philosophy of the ages, especially Kant and Hume. But to start off with, the first few chapters are a more traditional expository type of thing. There's a bit of stuff on the history of postmodernism, history of the idea that what we see or what we experience with our senses is not quite reality. And apparently this goes all the way back, not even just to the Greeks, but there's a whole tradition of skepticism in Western philosophy. And I kind of thought that postmodernism was kind of a disease of the 60s that really kind of cropped up there. But really, it's as old as Western philosophy itself, and it has just taken, this many centuries for all of these ideas to trickle down to the masses. So she's got quotes from everybody, from Hegel to Hume, Kant, Rorty, all of the super modern ones, the ones that, the philosophers that are still around, as well as people like Montaigne, who, people who wrote in the 1500s. What's really interesting is the historical sequence of how this has happened, because the really high up philosophers they started off, let's say, in the Middle Ages, everything was very religious and everything was about faith. And then they went very quickly during the Renaissance from faith to reason. And then they went very, very quickly from reason to skepticism, the idea that we can't really trust reason, we can't trust our senses. And so basically, philosophy since essentially the Renaissance has been fleshing out these ideas of skepticism. So we had a very long period of faith, a very short period of reason as far as the philosophers go, and a very long period of skepticism. So when you look at how long it took this sequence to trickle down to the rest of us, we're only recently beginning to become less religious, and if you think of like the whole last century as maybe not the last century, if you think of maybe the 19th century as kind of a renaissance of reason, in maybe the first half of the 20th century, we got everything from the plane, the radio, even the computer, and all of this, started rolling about until about the 50s when skepticism, really came about. And so we've had maybe the last 60 years where the mainstream philosophy is one of skepticism. Well, skepticism started centuries and centuries ago. It didn't even start then, but as far as large movements of skepticism, this happened centuries ago. So the pattern suggests that we are in for several more centuries of skepticism, And but the good news is that the academic philosophers seem to be understanding that skepticism falls underneath its own weight, that you can't, that if you say that you can't really know anything, then you don't know that you don't know anything. It's just mired in self-contradiction. And if Ayn Rand was the first of their return, then that's probably boding well for the future of reason. So anyway, back to the book. This is just a fantastic book. I mean, there have been a select few books that have really made me sit up and say, wow, the universe is more clear now. And this book is definitely one of them. It compares, to me, favorably to much of the best of Ayn Rand's writing. It compares very favorably to Atheism, the Case Against God. That's one of the best philosophy books I've ever read. It's a wonderful book. Might have to do a review on that one someday. But yeah, every page in my copy here is marked up somehow with notes in the margin, underlined. I usually dog-ear my books, but in this case it would be redundant because I'd be dog-earing everything. So go out and get the Slightest Philosophy. Oh, I should tell you that the Slightest Philosophy is a quote from Hume. He says essentially that well, anyone who has learned the slightest philosophy knows that what we experience through the senses are mere perceptions, and they don't really reflect reality. So that's about it. Go out and get this book. It's relatively cheap. It's self-published, which is such a shame. I mean, it's such an excellent book. It definitely needs a wider readership. It is truly excellent. I mean, she should submit this book to big-name publishers. It is truly wonderful, and it's very readable, and it's even funny. In fact, I think somewhere she says, my goal here is to write the world's first funny epistemology book, and I think she succeeded.